At midnight, the God of Israel walked through Egypt. Not a wind, not a plague carried on the backs of insects, not hail from a darkened sky. This time, God himself moved through the land. And in his wake, every firstborn son in the most powerful civilization on earth stopped breathing. From the palace of Pharaoh, where the heir to the throne lay in sheets of linen so fine they were worth more than a common man earned in a lifetime, to the mud-brick cell of the lowest prisoner chained beneath the earth, to the cattle pens where the finest bulls stood in the dark, every firstborn, in a single night, in a single hour, some say in a single breath. The scream that erupted from Egypt that night had no precedent in human history. Scripture records it with devastating simplicity. Exodus chapter 12, verse 30. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Not a house. Think about that. Not a single Egyptian home was spared. In a civilization of millions, every household woke to death. Fathers stumbled through darkness to find their eldest sons cold. Mothers screamed over cradles. Old men found their grown sons lifeless beside their wives. The wealthiest families in the ancient world and the poorest slaves, locked in dungeons, shared the same grief at the same moment under the same sky. And in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, not a single child was harmed. But to understand how the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob came to unleash the most devastating single act of divine judgment in the entire Old Testament, we must go back, not days, not months. We must go back 400 years, 400 years of silence, 400 years of slavery, 400 years in which an entire people cried out to a God who seemed to have forgotten them. This is that story. And it begins not with God, but with a king who asked the wrong question. Long before Moses was born, long before the plagues, long before the night of death, there was a time when the children of Israel were honored guests in Egypt. They had come at the invitation of Pharaoh himself during the years of famine, because a Hebrew boy named Joseph had risen from slavery to become the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Joseph had saved Egypt from starvation through his gift of prophetic interpretation, and in gratitude, Pharaoh had given Joseph's family the fertile land of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta. For a generation, perhaps two, the Israelites prospered under Egyptian protection, but then something changed. Exodus chapter 1 verse 8 records it in a single chilling sentence. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph, a new dynasty, a new Pharaoh, and with him a new calculation. This Pharaoh looked at the Israelites, who had multiplied across the generations into a population of hundreds of thousands, and he did not see allies. He did not see the descendants of the man who had saved his nation. He saw a threat, a foreign people growing too fast, living on strategic land near the eastern border, who might one day side with Egypt's enemies in a time of war. And so the decree came, not suddenly, not all at once. It came the way all atrocities come, gradually, in stages, each one a little worse than the last, each one normalizing what would have been unthinkable a generation before. First came forced labor. Exodus chapter 1 verses 11 through 14 describes what happened with unflinching clarity. The Egyptians set taskmasters over the Israelites to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. They were forced to make bricks from Nile mud mixed with straw, thousands of bricks a day under the Egyptian sun, and carried on their shoulders in baskets until their backs bent and their skin cracked. They dug irrigation channels, they hauled stone. They worked in the fields from before dawn until after dark, and when they collapsed, the overseers beat them with rods until they stood again or did not stand again. The Hebrew word the Bible uses for how the Egyptians treated them is bipharik. It means ruthlessly, without mercy, with deliberate cruelty, designed not just to extract labor, but to break the human spirit. And the text says something remarkable about what happened next. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. The Egyptians could beat them. They could starve them. They could work them until their hands bled and their bones showed through their skin. But they could not stop them from having children. They could not stop them from growing. This infuriated Pharaoh. And so the second stage began. If you grew up in church, you probably heard this next part as a children's story. Moses in the basket, the brave mother, the kind princess. But the event that put Moses in that basket was not a children's story. It was a state-sponsored program of infanticide that would make the modern world recoil in horror. Pharaoh first called the Hebrew midwives, 2 women named Shiphrah and Puah, and gave them a direct order. Exodus chapter 1 verses 15 and 16. When you help the Hebrew women give birth, look at the child. If it is a son, kill him. If it is a daughter, let her live. The midwives refused. They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, and they let the boys live. When Pharaoh confronted them, they lied. They told him the Hebrew women were too vigorous, that they gave birth before the midwives could arrive. Pharaoh may or may not have believed them, but their defiance only delayed what was coming, because then Pharaoh issued his third decree, and this one was not given to midwives in secret. This one was given to all his people. Every Egyptian citizen became an instrument of genocide. Exodus chapter 1 verse 22. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. Every Hebrew baby boy was to be thrown into the Nile, not killed quickly, not hidden away, thrown into the river to drown, in public, where everyone could see, where the mothers could hear the splash and the silence that followed. Think about what this means. Egyptian soldiers going door to door in the Hebrew quarter of Goshen, ripping newborn boys from their mothers' arms, carrying them screaming to the riverbank, throwing them into the current while their families watched, day after day, week after week, month after month. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, the river the Egyptians worshipped as a god, stained with the blood of Hebrew infants. This was not ancient history to the Israelites who lived through it. This was Monday. This was what happened to your neighbor's son. This was the reason your sister had not spoken in 3 months. This was the sound you heard from 2 houses down at dawn when the soldiers came, and no one stopped it. No army came to save them. No nation intervened. And for 400 years, according to Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, this people endured. Not just the killing of their sons, which may have lasted years or decades, but the slavery, the beatings, the dehumanization, generation after generation of Hebrew children born into a world where their only purpose was to make bricks for a king who wanted them dead. 400 years. To put that in perspective, 400 years ago from today, the Pilgrims had not yet landed at Plymouth Rock. The entire history of the United States of America fits inside the time that Israel spent in Egyptian bondage. Every generation of Israelites was born into slavery, lived in slavery, and died in slavery, and their children after them, and their children after them. And through all of it, they cried out to God. Exodus chapter 2 verses 23 through 25 records what happened at the end of those 4 centuries with the restraint of a narrator who knows what is coming. And the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. God heard. God remembered, God looked, God had respect unto them. 4 verbs. 400 years of silence, and then 4 verbs that changed the course of human history. Because what came next was not a rescue mission. It was a reckoning. The man God chose for this reckoning was, by any measure, the most unlikely candidate in the ancient world. Moses was a Hebrew by blood, but an Egyptian by upbringing. His mother, Jochebed, had hidden him for 3 months after his birth to protect him from Pharaoh's decree. When she could hide him no longer, she waterproofed a basket with pitch and tar, placed her infant son inside, and set him among the reeds at the edge of the Nile. The same river that was swallowing Hebrew boys became the vessel that saved this one. Pharaoh's own daughter found the basket. She knew the child was Hebrew. She knew what her father's decree demanded, and she chose to defy it. She adopted the boy and raised him in the palace of the very king who had ordered his death. She named him Moses, which in Egyptian means drawn out of the water. Consider the layers of this story. The man who would one day stand before Pharaoh and demand the release of 2 million slaves was raised in Pharaoh's own house. He ate at Pharaoh's table. He studied in Pharaoh's schools. He learned Egyptian writing, Egyptian warfare, Egyptian politics, Egyptian religion. He knew how the court functioned. He knew the protocols, the hierarchies, the weaknesses. He knew the names of their gods and the rituals of their priests. God was training the instrument of Egypt's judgment inside Egypt's own palace. But Moses fled Egypt at the age of 40 after killing an Egyptian overseer who was beating a Hebrew slave. He spent the next 40 years in the wilderness of Midian, tending sheep for his father-in-law Jethro. 40 years in the silence of the desert. 40 years watching flocks graze on scrub grass while his people made bricks and buried their children. And then, at the age of 80, Moses saw a bush on fire. It burned, but it was not consumed. And from within the flames, God spoke. He told Moses what he had seen and what he intended to do. Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows, and I am come down to deliver them. I am come down, not I am sending help, not I am raising an army. I am come down. God himself was entering the fight. Moses asked the question that any man standing barefoot before a burning bush would ask, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and who shall I say sent me?" God's answer was 3 words that would echo through the corridors of eternity. Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, I am that I am. Tell them I am has sent you. Not a name derived from nature like the Egyptian gods. Not a name tied to a river or a sun or a harvest. A name that simply declared existence itself. I am. I exist. I am the one who is. And now Pharaoh, who considered himself a god on earth, who claimed authority over life and death, who threw babies into the Nile and worked men until they died, was about to discover what it meant to stand against the one who simply is. Moses returned to Egypt. He was 80 years old, a shepherd with a wooden staff and a stutter, accompanied by his brother Aaron. They walked into the throne room of the most powerful ruler in the known world and delivered God's message with words that would become among the most famous in all of Scripture. Let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. Pharaoh's response is recorded in Exodus chapter 5, verse 2, and it reveals everything about the man who would bring the wrath of God down upon his own nation. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. Who is the Lord? That was the question Pharaoh asked, and the 10 plagues of Egypt were God's answer. Not an argument, not a negotiation, not a theological debate. An answer written in blood and darkness and death, plague by plague, each one more devastating than the last, each one tearing apart the fabric of Egyptian life, each one targeting a different god in Egypt's pantheon of over 2,000 deities. until there was nothing left. No God, no army, no economy, no pride, no heir. You asked who I am, Pharaoh. Now I will show you. The first plague came without further warning. Moses and Aaron met Pharaoh at the edge of the Nile at dawn and struck the water with the staff. Exodus chapter 7, verses 20 and 21. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. The Nile was not merely a river to the Egyptians, it was the source of all life. It watered their crops, it fed their cattle, it sustained their cities. They worshipped it as a god. Hapi, the deity of the Nile's annual flood, was among the most revered figures in their religion, and now the river they worshipped ran red with blood. The fish that fed the nation floated belly up along the banks. The stench of death hung over the water. For 7 days, the Egyptians could not drink from the river that had defined their civilization for millennia. And here is the detail that the text records with quiet horror. This was the same river into which Pharaoh had ordered Hebrew babies thrown. The Nile that had swallowed the sons of Israel now bled as if the river itself remembered. But Pharaoh's magicians replicated the trick. They turned more water to blood, proving nothing except their willingness to make the crisis worse. And Pharaoh hardened his heart. He turned and went into his palace and did not even take this to heart. 7 days later, the second plague. Aaron stretched his hand over the waters of Egypt, and frogs came up and covered the land, not a few frogs near the riverbank, frogs in the bedrooms, frogs in the ovens, frogs in the kneading bowls where bread was made, frogs crawling across the faces of sleeping children, frogs piled in the streets, crunching underfoot with every step, millions of them, breeding in a frenzy that defied nature until the entire nation was crawling with amphibians. The Egyptians worshipped a goddess named Heket, depicted with the head of a frog, associated with fertility and childbirth. God took the sacred animal of Egypt's fertility goddess and turned it into a plague so revolting that Pharaoh himself begged Moses to make it stop. He even promised to let the people go if the frogs were removed. Moses prayed. The frogs died where they were. They gathered them into piles, and the land stank with rotting frogs, and Pharaoh saw that there was relief, and he hardened his heart. The third plague came without warning. No announcement, no visit to the palace. Aaron simply struck the dust of the ground, and the dust became lice. Some translations say gnats. The Hebrew word kinim refers to a biting insect so small it could barely be seen, but it covered every human and every animal in Egypt. Imagine a nation of millions suddenly infested with insects that crawled into their ears, their nostrils, the corners of their eyes, burrowing into the skin of their cattle until the animals bellowed in pain. This time, something changed. Pharaoh's magicians tried to replicate the plague and failed. For the first time, the court sorcerers admitted the truth. They said to Pharaoh, Exodus chapter 8, verse 19, "This is the finger of God, not even his hand, his finger." And already the magicians of Egypt knew they were outmatched. But Pharaoh did not listen. The text says his heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them. 3 plagues, 3 gods of Egypt humiliated, the river god, the fertility goddess, the earth god, and Pharaoh had not moved. He had not released a single slave. He had not acknowledged the God of Israel. He had watched his river bleed, his nation crawl with vermin, his own sorcerers admit defeat. And he said, no. If you are listening to this and wondering why God did not simply force Pharaoh to let the Israelites go after the first plague, you are asking the question that the text itself is building toward. Because the plagues were never just about freeing the slaves. They were about answering the question, "Who is the Lord?" Pharaoh asked it with arrogance. God answered it with escalating devastation. Each plague was a lesson, each plague was a revelation, and each refusal from Pharaoh earned a more terrible response. The classroom was Egypt, the lesson was the identity of God. And Pharaoh was about to discover that the tuition was paid in suffering. The fourth plague marked a turning point. God sent swarms of flies upon Egypt, but for the first time he made a distinction. The land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was untouched. Exodus chapter 8, verses 22 and 23. "And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth." This was no longer a cosmic display of power. This was personal. God was drawing a line through the land of Egypt, and on one side of that line was devastation, and on the other was peace. Every Egyptian could look toward Goshen and see the truth. The Hebrew God could protect his own, and the Egyptian gods could not. Pharaoh negotiated, he offered compromises. "Worship your God here in Egypt," he said. "Go, but not too far. Take the men, but leave the women and children." Each time Moses refused. Each time Pharaoh hardened his heart after the plague was removed. The fifth plague killed the livestock. Every horse, donkey, camel, ox and sheep belonging to the Egyptians died. The economy of Egypt collapsed in a single day. Apis, the sacred bull god, the symbol of Egyptian strength and fertility, was powerless to protect even a single calf. And Pharaoh sent investigators to the land of Goshen. They reported back that not one animal belonging to the Israelites had died. Not one. Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The sixth plague bypassed the animals and went straight to the people. Moses took handfuls of soot from a furnace and threw it into the air before Pharaoh's eyes. As the ash settled, boils erupted on the skin of every Egyptian in the land, painful, oozing sores that covered their bodies from head to foot. The magicians, who had been present for every plague, who had replicated the first two and failed at the third, could not even stand before Moses now. Exodus chapter 9, verses 10 and 11. The boils were upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. The very men who served as intermediaries between Egypt and its gods were now crawling on the floor, covered in sores, unable even to stand in the presence of Moses. And Pharaoh hardened his heart. 6 plagues, 6 gods defeated: the river, the land, the air, the animals, the bodies of the people, the professional priests of Egypt's religion, and Pharaoh had not moved. The 7th plague was different. Before unleashing it, God spoke directly to Pharaoh through Moses with a message that revealed the true purpose behind everything that had happened. Exodus chapter 9, verse 16, "And in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth." Read that again. God was telling Pharaoh to his face that the reason Pharaoh existed at all was so that God could use him as a demonstration. The most powerful man in the ancient world was a prop in a divine exhibition. Every refusal, every hardened heart, every stubborn no, was not Pharaoh asserting his authority. It was Pharaoh playing the role that God had assigned him, whether he knew it or not. The king who asked, "Who is the Lord?" was being told that the Lord was the one who had placed him on the throne, specifically to knock him off it. And then God did something he had not done before. He gave a warning, not to Pharaoh alone, but to all of Egypt. Exodus chapter 9, verses 19 and 20. "Send therefore now, and gather thy cattle, and all that thou hast in the field, for upon every man and beast which shall be found in the field, and shall not be brought home, the hail shall come down upon them, and they shall die." And the text records that some of Pharaoh's servants, those who feared the word of the Lord, brought their livestock inside. But those who disregarded the word of the Lord left their servants and cattle in the field. Even in judgment, God offered mercy to those willing to listen. Even in the middle of systematically dismantling the most powerful civilization on earth, he paused to say, "Bring your animals inside. What is coming will kill anything left in the open." Some listened, most did not. Then Moses stretched his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail and fire that ran along the ground. Exodus chapter 9, verses 23 through 25. And the hail smote throughout all the land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast. And the hail smote every herb of the field, and brake every tree of the field. This was not a hailstorm. This was an artillery bombardment from the sky. Stones of ice the size of a man's fist fell from a sky streaked with lightning, and between the hailstones, fire ran along the ground like a river of flame. Trees shattered, crops were beaten flat, servants and animals caught in the open were killed where they stood. The sound alone would have been apocalyptic, the crashing of ice on stone. The crack of lightning striking so fast it sounded like a continuous roar. The screaming of animals, the screaming of men. Nut, the sky goddess, who was supposed to control the heavens. Set, the god of storms, who was supposed to command the weather. Osiris, the god of crops, who was supposed to protect the harvest. All of them silent, all of them powerless. The sky that Egypt worshipped was now trying to kill them. Pharaoh cracked. He summoned Moses and Aaron and said words he had never spoken before. Exodus chapter 9, verse 27. I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. A confession, a genuine confession. The king who had asked, "Who is the Lord?" now called the Lord righteous and himself wicked. Moses prayed. The hail stopped. The fire died. The thunder ceased. And as soon as the skies cleared, Pharaoh hardened his heart again. This is the pattern that should disturb you, not because Pharaoh was uniquely evil, but because the pattern is so recognizable. In the moment of crisis, he repented. The instant the crisis passed, he returned to exactly who he had always been. The confession was real in the moment and worthless the moment after. He did not change. He endured. And endurance without change is not strength. It is the most dangerous form of stubbornness. The 8th plague was locusts. Moses warned Pharaoh, and this time even Pharaoh's own advisors turned against their king. Exodus chapter 10, verse 7. And Pharaoh's servants said unto him, How long shall this man be a snare unto us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? Pharaoh's own court was telling him it was over. Egypt was finished. The economy was shattered. The livestock was dead. The crops were beaten to pulp by hail. The people were covered in boils. And the man sitting on the throne of the most powerful nation on earth was still saying no to a god who had defeated every deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Pharaoh tried to negotiate again. He told Moses the men could go, but the women and children had to stay. Hostages, insurance. Moses refused, and then the locusts came. Exodus chapter 10, verses 14 and 15. And the locusts went up over all the land of Egypt, and rested in all the coasts of Egypt. Very grievous were they. Before them there were no such locusts as they, neither after them shall be such. For they covered the face of the whole earth, so that the land was darkened, and they did eat every herb of the land, and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. And there remained not any green thing in the trees, or in the herbs of the field, through all the land of Egypt. Whatever the hail had not destroyed, the locusts devoured. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every grain of wheat left standing, every fruit on every tree. The land of Egypt, which had been one of the most fertile territories in the ancient world, was stripped bare. The breadbasket of the Mediterranean was empty. Serapis, the god who was supposed to protect Egypt from locusts, had failed. The prayers of the priests went unanswered. The temple stood surrounded by fields of nothing. And still, after Moses prayed, and a wind carried the locusts into the Red Sea, Pharaoh refused to let the people go. The ninth plague was perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all, because this one struck at the very heart of Egyptian identity. Egypt was the land of Ra, the sun god. Ra was the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon. The pharaoh himself was considered the living embodiment of Ra's power on earth. The sun was not merely a celestial body to the Egyptians, it was the face of their highest god. It was the proof that their religion was true, that their king was divine, that their civilization was blessed. And then the sun went out. Moses stretched his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt. Exodus chapter 10 verses 22 and 23. And there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. 3 days, not a solar eclipse which lasts minutes. 3 full days of absolute darkness. The text says it was a darkness that could be felt. A heavy, suffocating blackness that pressed against the skin like a physical weight. No torches could cut it, no lamps could pierce it. The Egyptians sat in their homes, blind, unable to see their own hands in front of their faces, unable to see their children, unable to move for 3 days. And in Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, the sun shone. If you want to understand what this plague meant to the Egyptian psyche, imagine waking up one morning and discovering that gravity no longer works, but only for you. The most fundamental, reliable, constant feature of your world, the thing you built your entire civilization around, the thing your king claimed personal authority over, has simply stopped. And meanwhile, the slaves you have been beating for 4 centuries are walking around in broad daylight, looking up at a sun that shines only for them. Ra was dead, or worse than dead, Ra was irrelevant. The sun god of Egypt could not light a single Egyptian home, while the god of the Hebrews lit every Hebrew home simultaneously. The theological implications were annihilating. Everything the Egyptians believed about their gods, their king, their destiny, their superiority, was exposed as a lie in 3 days of impenetrable darkness. Pharaoh called Moses one last time. "Go," he said, "serve your God. Take your families, but leave your flocks and herds behind." One final attempt to maintain some leverage, some control. Moses refused. "Not a hoof shall be left behind," he said. And Pharaoh said the words that sealed his fate and the fate of every firstborn in Egypt. Exodus chapter 10 verse 28. "Get thee from me, take heed to thyself, see my face no more, for in that day thou seest my face, thou shalt die." Moses looked at the king of Egypt, the man who had defied God through 9 plagues, the man who had watched his river bleed and his sky go dark, and his people suffer in ways that had never been seen before and would never be seen again. And Moses answered with words that carried the weight of a prophecy Pharaoh did not yet understand. "Thou hast spoken well. I will see thy face again no more." The next time Pharaoh spoke to Moses, it would not be from a throne. It would be in the middle of the night, standing over the body of his dead son, begging the Hebrew prophet to leave. Now we come to the night itself. And before we go any further, you need to understand something that the Sunday school version of this story never explains. The 10th plague was not like the other 9. The other 9 were escalating demonstrations of power. They were loud, they were visible, they were spectacular in their destruction. Rivers of blood, skies of fire, darkness you could feel. The 10th plague was silent. No storm, no swarm, no spectacle, just death moving through the land like a whisper, touching the firstborn of every household that was not marked by blood. And that detail, the blood, is what separates this plague from everything that came before. Because for the first time, God did not simply divide between Egyptians and Israelites by geography. He divided them by obedience, by faith, by a choice that every household had to make before midnight. Here is what God commanded, Exodus chapter 12, verses 3 through 7. On the 10th day of the month, every household was to select a lamb, not any lamb, a male lamb, 1 year old, without blemish, without a single defect. They were to keep this lamb in their home for 4 days. 4 days of feeding it, 4 days of watching it, 4 days during which their children would play with it and name it and grow attached to it. God did not want this sacrifice to be easy. He wanted them to feel the cost. On the 14th day of the month, at twilight, every family was to slaughter their lamb. They were to collect its blood in a basin, and then they were to take a branch of hyssop, dip it in the blood, and paint the blood on the top and both sides of the doorframe of their house. Not the back of the house, not the roof, the doorframe, the entrance, the place where every person who came and went would see it. The blood had to be visible. It had to be a declaration. This house belongs to the God of Israel. This household has obeyed. This family has sacrificed. Then they were to go inside, close the door, and eat the lamb, roasted over fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, standing up, fully dressed, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, ready to move at a moment's notice. They were not eating a meal. They were eating a departure. Every detail of the preparation was a statement. We are leaving tonight. After 400 years, we are leaving. And then God told them why. Exodus chapter 12, verses 12 and 13. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord, and the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. This is where the word Passover comes from. Not from a holiday, not from a tradition, from a night of death in which the only thing standing between a family and the destruction of their firstborn was the blood of a lamb on a door frame. Think about what it must have been like inside those Hebrew homes that night. The lamb had been slaughtered. The blood was on the door. The family stood inside, eating in silence, dressed for travel, listening. Outside, they could hear nothing. Not yet. The night was still. Egypt had been dark for 3 days before this, and now on this night, the darkness had a different quality. This was not the plague of darkness. The stars were visible. The moon hung over the Nile Delta. But the air itself felt heavy, charged, as if the atmosphere knew what was coming. The children asked questions. Why are we eating standing up? Why is there blood on the door? Where are we going? The parents answered with voices that tried to sound calm but were not calm at all. Because God told us to. Because tonight something is going to happen. Because we have been slaves for 400 years and tonight we stop being slaves. And then midnight came. The text does not describe what the angel of death looked like. It does not describe a sound or a wind or a visible presence moving through the streets of Egypt. The Bible simply says what happened with a precision that is more horrifying than any dramatic description could ever be. Exodus chapter 12, verse 29. And it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Read the scope of that verse again. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, the crown prince, the heir to the most powerful throne on earth, to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, the lowest, most forgotten human being in Egyptian society. Every social class, every neighborhood, every house, the general's son in the barracks, the priest's son in the temple quarters, the merchant's son in the market district, the farmer's son in the rural villages along the Nile, the fisherman's son on the Delta coast, all of them, At the same time, at midnight, there was no disease to diagnose, no poison to trace, no weapon to identify. Children who had been breathing simply stopped. Young men who had been sleeping simply did not wake. Firstborn sons of every age, from infants in cradles to grown men with families of their own, were struck dead in an instant. The cause of death, if an Egyptian physician had examined the bodies, would have been nothing. No marks, no wounds, no explanation, just death, precise and absolute, selecting only the firstborn of every household and leaving everyone else untouched. The mathematics of this plague are staggering. Egypt's population in the 15th century before Christ is estimated at 3 to 4 million. If we assume an average household size and the statistical distribution of firstborn sons across the population, the number of dead in a single night could have been anywhere from several 100,000 to over 1 million in 1 hour, without a single sword being drawn. And then the screaming began. Exodus chapter 12, verse 30. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. A great cry. The Hebrew phrase is tse'aka gedola. It means a scream of anguish so raw, so primal, that it defies translation. This was not weeping. This was not mourning. This was a sound that erupted simultaneously from millions of throats across an entire civilization. Mothers finding their children dead in their beds. Fathers shaking sons who would not wake. Grandparents discovering that the grandson they had held that afternoon was cold to the touch. Not a house where there was not one dead. The precision of that statement is devastating. In all of Egypt, there was no household that escaped, no family that was overlooked, no corner of the kingdom where a firstborn son survived the night, the wealthy and the poor, the powerful and the enslaved, the pious priest who had faithfully served Ra and the criminal rotting in a cell, all equal, all bereaved, all screaming into the same dark sky, and in Goshen, where the blood was on the doorframes, silence. Not one Hebrew child had been touched, not one firstborn son had stopped breathing. The families who had obeyed God's command stood inside their homes, holding their children, listening to the screams rising from across the border of their settlement like a wall of sound that carried the entire grief of a nation. Now here is where the symmetry of divine justice becomes impossible to ignore. And this is the detail that should keep you awake tonight. Pharaoh had ordered the murder of Hebrew children. Specifically, he had ordered that every Hebrew boy be thrown into the Nile to drown. He targeted the sons. He targeted the firstborn of an entire people. He used death as a tool of population control and political oppression. And God's response, when it finally came, was a perfect mirror. You killed their sons. I will kill yours. You targeted the firstborn of my people. I will take the firstborn of yours. You drowned Hebrew babies in the river. I will drown your entire army in the sea. The symmetry is not accidental. It is not coincidental. It is the signature of a God who does not merely punish, but who answers. Crime for crime, measure for measure. The same instrument of cruelty that Pharaoh wielded against the powerless was turned back upon him with devastating precision. Pharaoh's own firstborn son, the crown prince of Egypt, the boy who had grown up in the same palace where Moses had once been raised, died at midnight, along with every other firstborn in the kingdom. While Pharaoh stood over his son's body, somewhere in the darkness of Goshen, Hebrew mothers were holding their living sons and remembering the sons that had been taken from them. The sons thrown into the Nile, the sons ripped from their arms by Egyptian soldiers, the sons whose names were never recorded in any history, Egyptian or Hebrew. God remembered them, and the price for their blood was paid in a single night. Pharaoh did not wait for morning. He called for Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night, Exodus chapter 12, verses 31 and 32. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise up and get you forth from among my people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as ye have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as ye have said, and be gone. And bless me also, and bless me also. 3 words that reveal the total collapse of Pharaoh's defiance. The man who had asked, Who is the Lord?, was now asking for a blessing from the Lord's prophet. The man who had refused to let a single Hebrew leave was now begging them all to go. The man who had claimed divinity, who had sat on a throne as the living embodiment of Ra, was standing in the dark over his dead son, asking a former shepherd to pray for him. The Egyptians did not just let the Israelites leave, they pushed them out. Exodus chapter 12, verse 33. And the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We be all dead men, we be all dead men. The Egyptians believed that if the Israelites stayed another night, they would all die, not just the firstborn, all of them. The terror was absolute. The people who had enslaved the Hebrews for 4 centuries were now physically pushing them toward the exits, pressing gold and silver and clothing into their hands, anything to make them leave faster. Exodus chapter 12, verses 37 and 38. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men, beside children. And a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, even very much cattle, 600,000 men on foot, not counting women and children. The total number of Israelites who left Egypt that night is estimated at 2 million or more. They walked out of the land that had enslaved them for 400 years, carrying Egyptian gold on their shoulders and unleavened bread in their kneading bowls, because the dough had not had time to rise. And a mixed multitude went with them, not just Hebrews, Egyptians who had seen the power of the Hebrew God and chose to follow, servants, laborers, people of other nations who had been trapped in Egypt and saw this as their chance. The Exodus was not a tribal escape. It was a mass migration of everyone who believed that the God who killed every firstborn in Egypt in a single night was a God worth following into the desert. But God was not finished with Pharaoh, because the pattern held. Even after burying his firstborn son, even after pushing the Israelites out of his kingdom with his own hands, even after standing in the wreckage of a civilization that had been systematically dismantled by 10 acts of divine judgment, Pharaoh's heart hardened one final time. When word reached the palace that the Israelites were camped by the Red Sea, trapped between the water and the wilderness, Pharaoh made his last decision. He gathered 600 of his best chariots, along with every other chariot in Egypt, and he rode out to bring the Hebrews back. Not because he needed their labor. His economy was already destroyed. Not because they posed a military threat. They were unarmed families with children and livestock. He pursued them because he could not accept that he had lost. He could not accept that the God he had defied for the span of 10 plagues had won. His pride, the same pride that had made him ask, Who is the Lord? The same pride that had made him harden his heart 9 times, drove him toward the sea one last time. And the sea was waiting for him. Moses stretched his hand over the water. The Red Sea divided. The Israelites walked through on dry ground, walls of water standing on their left and their right. And when the last Hebrew foot stepped onto the far shore, when Pharaoh's chariots were in the middle of the seabed, the waters returned. Exodus chapter 14, verse 28. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them, not so much as one, the army that had enforced 400 years of slavery, the soldiers who had thrown Hebrew babies into the Nile, the charioteers who had ridden down fleeing families, every single one of them drowned in the sea. The same death Pharaoh had prescribed for Hebrew infants was now prescribed for his warriors. Water as the instrument of murder became water as the instrument of justice. Pharaoh drowned babies in the river. God drowned an army in the sea. The symmetry was complete. And on the far shore, Moses sang a song that would echo through 3,000 years of worship. Exodus chapter 15, verse 3. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Not a distant deity, not a philosophical abstraction, not a gentle shepherd with a crook, a warrior. A God who fights for the people who cannot fight for themselves. A God who hears the screams of slaves and answers with plagues and parted seas and the destruction of the most powerful military force on earth. This is the verse your pastor probably never preached on a Sunday morning. The Lord is a man of war. It does not fit neatly on a greeting card. It does not work as a bumper sticker, but for 2 million people who had just walked through the sea on dry ground, leaving 400 years of slavery behind them and the bodies of their oppressors floating in the surf, it was the truest thing they had ever heard. Now, if this story were simply about the liberation of an ancient people from an ancient empire, it would be remarkable enough. But the 10th plague and the Exodus are not merely historical events. They are the foundational narrative of the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. Everything that follows in the Bible, from the giving of the law at Sinai, to the conquest of Canaan, to the establishment of the monarchy, to the prophetic tradition, to the life of Jesus of Nazareth, is built on the events of this night. The Passover lamb became the central symbol of the Jewish faith. Every year, for more than 3,000 years, Jewish families have gathered on the 14th day of the month of Nisan to reenact the meal that their ancestors ate standing up, dressed for travel, with blood on the doorframe and the sound of Egypt dying outside their walls. The youngest child at the table asks 4 questions, the first of which is, why is this night different from all other nights? And the answer, passed down through 100 generations, is always the same. Because on this night, God delivered us from slavery. The bitter herbs represent the bitterness of bondage. The unleavened bread represents the haste of departure, the dough that did not have time to rise. The lamb represents the sacrifice that stood between the people and death. Every element of the meal is a memory. Every bite is a history lesson. And the lesson is always, God heard us, God remembered us, God came down. In the Christian tradition, the connections run even deeper. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Corinth, made the identification explicit. Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us, he wrote. The lamb without blemish that was slain at twilight in Egypt became, in Christian theology, a foreshadowing of the sacrifice of Jesus. The blood on the doorframe became a precursor to the blood of the cross. The death of the firstborn became a shadow of a God who would one day sacrifice his own firstborn son. Whether you read this story through a Jewish lens or a Christian one, the theological weight is the same. The God of the Bible is not a spectator. He does not sit at a distance and observe human suffering with detached interest. He enters, he acts, he fights, and when he judges, his judgment is precise enough to distinguish between one side of a door frame and the other. But here is where we must confront the question that this story forces upon every honest reader. Because the 10th plague is not a comfortable story. It is not a story you can tell without sitting with the darkness of what it describes. And if you are listening to this and feeling no discomfort at all, I would gently suggest that you have not yet heard what the text actually says. God killed children, not just the children of Pharaoh, who ordered the genocide of Hebrew babies, not just the children of generals and slave drivers and soldiers who whipped Hebrew men until they bled. The children of ordinary Egyptians, the children of farmers who had nothing to do with the political decisions of their king, the children of the captive in the dungeon, who was himself a prisoner and a victim, the firstborn of every household. The text does not carve out exceptions for the innocent. It does not say, except the families who were kind to the Hebrews, It does not say, except the children who were too young to have done anything wrong. It says every firstborn, and it means it. While Scripture does not record the individual stories of those Egyptian families, we can imagine them. A mother who had secretly brought food to her Hebrew neighbors, waking to find her eldest son dead. A farmer who had never owned a slave in his life, burying his boy at dawn. An old woman in a village 100 miles from the palace who had never even seen Pharaoh, screaming over the body of her grandson. This is the moral complexity that the text does not allow us to escape. The God who liberated the oppressed did so by visiting death upon the children of the oppressors, including children who had never oppressed anyone. The justice was real. The liberation was real. The suffering of innocent Egyptians was also real, and the Bible does not apologize for any of it. It does not explain it away. It does not offer a footnote that makes it easier to digest. What it offers instead is a question, the same question that has haunted every reader of this text for 3,000 years. Was this justice, or was this cruelty? And the answer the text gives is not a simple one. The answer is that when a nation builds its wealth on the broken bodies of slaves, when a king orders the murder of babies and then hardens his heart against 9 escalating warnings from God himself, the consequences are not surgical. They are catastrophic. And the weight of those consequences falls not only on the guilty, but on everyone who lived within the system that the guilty built. Pharaoh made the decision for all of Egypt. That is what absolute power means. When the king hardened his heart, every Egyptian family paid the price. Not because those families deserved it individually, but because they lived under a king who had been given 9 chances to avoid this night and refused every single one. 9 plagues. 9 warnings, 9 opportunities to say yes, and 9 times Pharaoh said no. The 10th plague was not God's first choice, it was his last resort. Let us now turn to what the world outside the Bible has to say about these events. Because the Exodus and the plagues have left traces outside of Scripture that continue to generate debate among historians, archaeologists, and scholars. The Ipuwer Papyrus is an ancient Egyptian document, officially designated Papyrus Leiden Fens 344, currently housed in the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, Netherlands. It was discovered in Egypt in the early 19th century and translated by the Egyptologist A.H. Gardner in 1909. The oldest surviving copy dates to approximately 1400 BC, which places it within a century of the commonly accepted date of the Exodus, around 1446 BC. The document is a lament, written from the perspective of an Egyptian scribe named Ipuwer, describing a series of catastrophes that devastated Egypt. And the parallels to the biblical account are remarkable. The papyrus describes the Nile turning to blood. It describes widespread death among livestock. It describes a darkness covering the land. It describes mass death and a great cry rising from the population. It describes servants fleeing the country, carrying gold and precious materials that belonged to their masters. It describes a total collapse of the social order, with the wealthy reduced to poverty and the powerful stripped of their authority. Scholars debate whether the Ipuwer Papyrus is a direct account of the events described in Exodus or a literary composition describing a different period of turmoil. Some Egyptologists categorize it as poetic fiction. Others argue that the specificity and emotional rawness of the descriptions point to genuine historical events. The debate continues. But what is not debatable is that an ancient Egyptian document exists that describes, in the voice of an Egyptian witness, catastrophes that align with extraordinary precision to the 10 plagues described in the Hebrew Bible. Beyond the Ipuwer Papyrus, archaeological excavations at Tel el-Dabba, the site of ancient Avaris in the Nile Delta, the region traditionally identified as Goshen, have revealed evidence of a significant Asiatic population living in conditions consistent with the biblical description of the Israelites. Mass graves have been found dating to the approximate period of the plagues. Evidence of sudden abandonment has been documented, suggesting a large population that left quickly rather than gradually. Egyptian royal inscriptions from this period are largely silent about any catastrophic defeat or mass departure of slaves. But this silence is itself consistent with what we know about Egyptian record-keeping. Egyptian monuments and inscriptions were propaganda. They recorded victories, they celebrated power, they did not memorialize defeats. A catastrophe of the magnitude described in Exodus, in which the gods of Egypt were publicly humiliated, the economy destroyed, the military drowned, and 2 million slaves walked out the front door carrying Egyptian gold, is precisely the kind of event that Egyptian scribes would have been ordered to erase from the record. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the nation that suffered the defeat had every reason to pretend it never happened. If you have been listening to this story and counting, you have noticed something about the structure of the plagues. They were not random. They were not arbitrary displays of power. They were a systematic deconstruction of the Egyptian worldview, executed in escalating order. The first 3 plagues, blood, frogs, and lice, attacked the natural world that Egypt depended on and worshipped: the river, the land, the very dust of the ground. The next 3 plagues, flies, livestock disease, and boils, attacked the living things of Egypt: the insects, the animals, the human body itself. The next 3 plagues, hail, locusts, and darkness, attacked the cosmic order, the sky, the harvest, the sun, and the 10th plague attacked the thing that mattered most: the children, the future, the firstborn sons who would inherit the land, carry the family name, sit on the thrones, tend the farms, serve in the temples. The 10th plague did not destroy Egypt's past. It destroyed Egypt's future. 9 plagues against 9 categories of Egyptian existence, each one escalating in severity, each one targeting a different sphere of life, each one defeating a different god, until there was nothing left to attack except the people themselves. And even then, God did not kill indiscriminately. He took only the firstborn, the representative, the symbolic head of each household and each herd. Each plague was also a direct assault on a specific Egyptian deity: the Nile turning to blood defeated Hapi, the god of the Nile, and Osiris, whose bloodstream the Nile was believed to be. The frogs defeated Heket, the frog goddess of fertility. The gnats defeated Geb, the god of the earth. The flies defeated Khepri, the scarab god. The livestock plague defeated Apis, the bull god, and Hathor, the cow goddess. The boils defeated Sekhmet, the goddess of healing. The hail defeated Nut, the sky goddess. The locust defeated Serapis, the protector from locusts. The darkness defeated Ra, the sun god, the supreme deity of Egypt. And the death of the firstborn defeated Isis, the goddess who protected children, and Pharaoh himself, who was considered the divine protector of all Egypt. When Pharaoh could not protect his own son, his claim to divinity died with the boy. 10 plagues, 10 gods defeated, 1 god proven supreme. The answer to "Who is the Lord?" was written across the landscape of Egypt in blood and fire and silence and death. And when it was finished, there was no Egyptian god left standing. The entire pantheon had been publicly, systematically, and irrevocably destroyed. The legacy of the Passover extends far beyond the ancient world. It has been told and retold for over 3,000 years, making it one of the oldest, continuously observed commemorations in human history. It has been painted by Michelangelo and Rembrandt. It has been set to music by Handel and Verdi. It has been debated by rabbis and theologians for millennia. It appears in the Quran. It shapes the liturgy of every Christian Easter. It informed the liberation theology of the American civil rights movement. It was invoked by enslaved Africans who saw in the story of the Hebrews their own story, and who sang, "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go," with the full weight of 400 years of American slavery behind those words. The story resonates because the dynamics it describes are not ancient, they are eternal. A powerful empire built on the labor of an enslaved people, a ruler who consolidates his power by dehumanizing a minority population, an escalating campaign of oppression that begins with forced labor, moves to cultural suppression, and ends with the killing of children. A population that cries out for deliverance and is met with silence for generations before the answer finally comes. 3,000 years later, the same patterns repeat. Different empires, different pharaohs, different slaves, but the same architecture of oppression and the same question at the center of it all. Where is God when the powerful crush the powerless? Where is justice when the innocent suffer? Why does deliverance take so long? The Exodus does not answer these questions with a philosophical argument. It answers them with a story. And the story says, God hears, God sees, God remembers. And when God acts, the most powerful empire on earth cannot stand against him. But the story also says something else, something harder. It says that justice has a cost, that deliverance does not come clean, that the night of liberation was also the night of death, and that the screams of freed slaves and the screams of bereaved Egyptian mothers rose into the same sky, carried by the same wind, heard by the same God. There is one final detail of this story that is often overlooked, and it may be the most important detail of all. When God gave the instructions for the Passover, he did not say, "I will see that you are Israelites and pass over you." He said, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." The blood, not the nationality, not the ethnicity, not the family name, the blood on the doorframe. This means that if an Egyptian family had killed a lamb, painted their doorframe with its blood, and eaten the meal as commanded, they would have been spared. And if a Hebrew family had refused to obey, had decided the command was superstitious or unnecessary, had left their doorframe bare, their firstborn would have died. The distinction was not racial, it was not ethnic, it was covenantal. It was based on a choice. Will you trust what God has said, even when it seems strange, even when the night is dark, even when you cannot see what is coming? Will you slaughter the lamb and paint the door and stand inside with your family and believe that the blood is enough? Some did. Most of the Israelites obeyed, and the text tells us that a mixed multitude left Egypt with them, which means Egyptians also made the choice. Egyptians who had watched 9 plagues destroy their nation and concluded that the God of the Hebrews was real. Egyptians who killed a lamb, painted their doors, and stood inside while their neighbors screamed. They left Egypt the next morning, walking alongside the people their nation had enslaved, following a God they had only just begun to know. And if that does not move you, consider what it means. In the middle of the most devastating judgment the world had ever seen, God left a door open. Not a wide door, not an easy door, a door marked with blood, requiring sacrifice, requiring obedience, requiring the willingness to act on faith before the evidence arrived. But a door nonetheless. The night of the 10th plague was the darkest night in the history of Egypt. But even in that darkness, there was a way through, for anyone willing to take it. The children of Israel walked out of Egypt the next morning, 2 million people, carrying unleavened bread that had not had time to rise, and Egyptian gold pressed into their hands by people who wanted them gone. They walked into a wilderness that would take them 40 years to cross, toward a land they had never seen but had been promised to their ancestors 5 centuries before. Behind them, Egypt smoldered. The river had bled. The sky had gone dark. The land had been stripped bare by locusts. The livestock was dead. The economy was destroyed. The military would soon lie at the bottom of the Red Sea. And in every house, from the palace to the prison, there was an empty bed where a firstborn son had slept. Pharaoh had asked, "Who is the Lord?" 10 plagues later he had his answer. The Lord is the God who hears the cry of slaves, the God who turns rivers to blood and skies to darkness, the God who defeats every false god in the pantheon of the most advanced civilization on earth, the God who walks through a nation at midnight and takes the life of every firstborn son while leaving the children of his people untouched, the God who parts seas and drowns armies and leads 2 million people out of bondage with a pillar of fire. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. And the question Pharaoh asked has echoed through every century since. It echoes in the courts of every empire that has built its wealth on the backs of the enslaved. It echoes in the palaces of every ruler who has believed himself untouchable. It echoes in every boardroom and every parliament and every throne room where the powerful look at the powerless and ask, with the same arrogance Pharaoh showed, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice?" The plagues of Egypt are the answer. They have always been the answer. And for 3,000 years, every generation has been given the same choice that was given to the Israelites on the night of the Passover. The lamb has been slaughtered, the blood is available, the door is open, midnight is coming. The only question is whether the blood is on your door. This is the story of the 10th plague. The night God walked through Egypt and killed every firstborn son. The night that a nation of slaves became a nation of the free. The night that the most powerful empire on earth discovered too late that it had been asking the wrong question all along. Not, "Who is the Lord?" but "What will the Lord do when he has heard enough?" Now you know the answer. And now you know why your Sunday school teacher never told you this version.